As all of you know by now, Nvidia just launched a couple of new graphics cards, and I'm a bit late to the party because I was at CES and then we decided to stay in the US a bit longer. But even though there's a lot of reviews out there already, I still thought it would be good to make this video in case it might end up being useful to at least some of you. So we've been testing these cards ever since we got back, and in this video I'm going to talk about the RTX 4070 Super and the RTX 4070 Ti Super, how they perform in 40 different games on 3 different resolutions, how they compare to the non-super versions, and most importantly, if you should buy them or not. Let's begin. The cards I'll be using for this video are the RTX 4070 Super Founders Edition from Nvidia and the RTX 4070 Ti Super Ventus from MSI, since the Founders Edition of that chip doesn't exist. Now, you might have heard from other reviewers that the Ventus card wasn't really performing as it should, which was a bad start for Nvidia and for MSI. But MSI said that that has been fixed with a VBIOS update, and the data I'll be showing today is from testing the card with that latest BIOS version. The RTX 4070 Super Founders Edition has the same cooler design as before, but this time around it is completely black, which I personally really like, but it also makes it sensitive to dust and to fingerprints. And even though they really look alike, it is much smaller than the new RTX 4080 Super Founders Edition. The Ti Super Ventus is MSI's MSRP model, but it still looks like a pretty impressive graphics card, and it has a very decent build quality even though the backplate is made out of plastic. Both the FE and the Ventus don't come with a lot of extra features, so they don't have dual BIOS, they don't have any RGB lights, and so on. Now, looking at the specs, the new 4070 Super comes in at the same $600 price as the original RTX 4070 when it launched last year, but it does get some extras over the original. So the core count goes up by about 20%, and it has more cache as well. The memory setup remains unchanged, and since the target clock speeds remain the same as well, it kind of makes sense that the TDP is slightly higher. But keep in mind, 220 watts still isn't that much. The old RTX 4070 isn't going anywhere, but it is getting a new recommended price of $550, which, given the spec differences, still feels a little bit high. So I would really like to see it approach the $500 mark instead. Now, the new 4070 Ti Super will replace the old 4070 Ti completely at the same $800 price point, so the old Ti will eventually disappear from the market. And here, the upgrade is a little bit different. So we only get a 10% increase in the core count, but we do get a VRAM upgrade going from 12 to 16 gigabytes with a matching 256-bit bus. And with the Ti Super, the TDP remains unchanged. Now, one key difference that isn't often highlighted is the fact that the 4070 Ti and the newer Ti Super are the lowest tier RTX 4000 cards that have dual encoders. The 4070 and the 4070 Super only have one. Now, that's not really relevant for gaming, but it's definitely worth thinking about if you're buying one of these cards for gaming and for editing, for example, or maybe some other use case that requires those encoders. Now, since these new cards use the same architecture and production process, there aren't any major feature changes to talk about, so Nvidia's focus remains on ray tracing, DLSS, frame generation, and just making sure that it is present in more and more games. But you might see some small feature changes in some of the partner cards that I will cover in my next video. Now, from a gaming perspective, I will mostly be focusing on the RTX 4070 Super because, in my opinion, the original 4070 was way more interesting than the 4070 Ti, and now the 4070 Super received the bigger upgrade than the Ti Super, so that perspective should more or less remain the same. Starting with Baldur's Gate 3, the old RTX 4070 already outperformed the RX 7800 XT from AMD, and the 4070 Super pulls away even further. On 1080p and 1440p, the differences are not significant, but on 4K resolution, the gains are enough to make it run a bit more comfortably. The 4070 Ti Super doesn't look that much better at 1080p and 1440p, but it is a bit faster on 4K resolution, which is nice. But keep in mind, you could just enable upscaling and be perfectly happy with any of these cards. Starfield ran really poorly on Nvidia cards when it launched, but luckily that has been fixed by now, and it actually ran well on these cards on 1080p and 1440p, but at 4K resolution, most were struggling to maintain 60 FPS. The 4070 Ti Super does manage to stay just above 60 on average, so upscaling is definitely recommended, and with DLSS on the quality setting, it was running great on both 4070 Super and the 4070 Ti Super, but the Ti Super did have a little bit more headroom. Remnant II is also quite heavy on the GPU, especially at 1440p and above. The 4070 Super did great on 1440p but started to struggle at 4K, while the Ti Super just managed to hold on to 60 FPS. So you should again enable DLSS for both cards here, which just makes the game run more comfortably. Avatar is an AMD sponsored title, but Nvidia actually performed quite a bit better. At 1440p, the 4070 Super is more than powerful enough, but it does start to struggle at 4K, where the Ti Super does give you just a little bit of extra. Again, with DLSS on, both do great. Alan Wake 2 on high settings is also very heavy to run. There's definitely some benefit to the Ti Super, but it doesn't change the fact that it's perfectly playable on 1440p with both cards, and then on 4K, they both lack a bit of power and require upscaling anyway. And in Microsoft Flight Simulator, it's a very similar story. They're all fine at 1080p and 1440p, and 4K native becomes hard to run on the 4070 Super and the 7800 XT, but spending a lot more on the Ti Super doesn't really help that much either. It does get slightly better, but it's not that significant from a user perspective, so once again, you will need to enable upscaling regardless of your choice, and then both the 4070 Super and the Ti Super will run the game easily. In some other titles, even the 4070 Super is already more than powerful enough for 4K resolution. In Spider-Man Remastered, for example, on high settings, a game that does favor Nvidia a bit more, it was just shy of 120 FPS on 4K resolution using the 4070 Super without any upscaling. The Ti Super is faster, but again, I'm not really seeing that much of an added value here. Palworld actually scales really nicely with GPU power, even on lower resolutions, and both the Super and the Ti Super managed to run the game fine all the way up to 4K resolution. Unfortunately, the Xbox Game Pass version does not support DLSS just yet, which I would recommend using, especially if you game on 4K resolution. Now, of course, I'm not going to talk about 40 different games individually, so let's move on to some summaries instead, starting with the 4070 Super on 1080p. And as you would expect, there's not a single game that the 4070 Super struggled with on this resolution. Most games run well over 120 FPS, and the ones that don't are typically bound by CPU performance, like Flight Simulator, for example. And the same can be said for the 4070 Ti Super, that is a few percent faster on average than the RTX 4070 Super. On 1440p, which is a more realistic resolution for this price point, there aren't many titles that both cards didn't run well. You can expect 100 FPS or more in the majority of games, or at least near 100 FPS in the heaviest of titles. Now, there's a few games that sit slightly lower, but enabling DLSS upscaling easily sorts that out. And in a case of a clear CPU bottleneck, like with the Microsoft Flight Simulator, NVIDIA's frame generation feature can smooth out the frame rate and get past that bottleneck. Now, it is still very important to mention that frame generation is not an ideal option for every game, but in a slow-paced and CPU-limited title like this one, it is definitely worth turning it on. 4K resolution is where things get a little bit more interesting for the 4070 Super. It still runs most games really well on native 4K, but it does struggle in the heaviest of titles, and with DLSS upscaling enabled, we actually got 60 FPS or more in each of the games we've tested. So even if most people won't consider this to be a real 4K graphics card, if this is what you can afford, you can get a decent 4K experience out of it. Now, the Ti Super definitely looks a bit more comfortable on this resolution, with more games running at 60 FPS or more without upscaling. But that being said, the upgrade is not big enough to run everything easily on 4K native, and you should enable upscaling in those GPU-intensive games as well. So I do think the value of the TI Super is somewhat debatable. Now, compared to the 4070 Super, the TI Super is about 10% faster on 1080p because we're frequently running into CPU or game engine limitations. It is about 15% faster on 1440p, and it is about 18% faster on 4K resolution. And given it is about 33% more expensive, I don't think it's worth considering for 1080p or 1440p gaming, unless you're like super concerned about the 12GB VRAM buffer on the cheaper model. The upgrade is more significant on 4K resolution, where the extra VRAM will matter more than on lower resolutions, and if your budget allows it, it is nice to get it over the Super. But I still think the price gap is quite large for a card that's not really meant for 4K gaming to begin with. So I hope that the TI Super would make more sense with NVIDIA's RTX showcase titles that feature full path tracing, but that wasn't always the case. In Alan Wake 2, with all the ray tracing features enabled, plus DLSS, ray reconstruction, frame generation, and basically all of NVIDIA's fancy bells and whistles, the 4070 Super did manage to do great at 1080p and 1440p, but it was not able to hit 60 FPS on 4K resolution. The TI Super did manage that, making it one example where the TI Super really made a meaningful difference in the whole experience. But then in Cyberpunk 2077, in its full path tracing mode, and again, with upscaling, ray reconstruction, and frame generation enabled, we're kind of back to where we were. The 4070 Super handled it great on 1080p and 1440p and then lacked power at 4K resolution, but the same goes for the TI Super. So you really need an RTX 4080 or better for that. And if you compare it to the new RTX 4080 Super that costs 25% more than the 4070 Ti Super, it will get you another 14% performance on 1440p and another 18% on 4K resolution, which makes it a much more comfortable choice, and that especially so if you're looking for 4K gaming. And if we leave path tracing out of it and just look at a couple of games that just include some forms of RTFX, we can see that both cards can handle that really well with DLSS upscaling enabled. So for me, the TI Super is kind of stuck in the middle between a perfectly capable 4070 Super and then proper high-end cards that cost more but actually offer big upgrades. Now, compared to the old RTX 4070, the 4070 Super numbers are what I would expect from a 20% plus core increase and 10% power increase. So a high single-digit improvement at 1080p and then approaching a 20% gap at 4K resolution, which is enough to make the 4070 Super a very interesting option. Now, it's not going to be an upgrade if you already own an RTX 4070, but if you're upgrading from something that's a bit older, it is definitely a nicer upgrade than the old 4070 was. The old 4070 would only be worth buying if the price gap is at least 15%, so if it costs closer to $500 when a Super is $600. The 4070 Super is now also faster than the RX 7800 XT that was outperforming the old RTX 4070. And keep in mind, I was even using the faster Gigabyte Gaming OC model for testing and not the reference AMD model that is a couple of percent slower while costing the same. And between the original 4070 and the RX 7800 XT, you could have made arguments to go either way. But now with the 4070 Super, I would say that the 7800 XT really needs to start dropping in price to be able to compete. Now, it still holds the price advantage, but NVIDIA has a slight advantage in core performance, in ray tracing performance. DLSS is still superior to FSR, and there are some other smaller features like NVIDIA Broadcast and so on. But between AMD and NVIDIA, there's also power consumption to consider. So if we look at a very GPU-heavy game like Cyberpunk 2077, the power consumption of the 4070 Super did increase a little bit in line with the TDP, but that's still less power than the RX 7800 XT uses. And depending on how much you game and how much you pay for your electricity, this information can be either completely useless to you or a complete deal breaker. So if you're gaming 2 hours a day on average and you're only paying about 10 cents per kilowatt hour, the difference in total cost of power will never bother you. But if you're someone that games a lot more and you're paying 40 cents per kilowatt hour, like in some parts of Europe and like we do here in the Netherlands, that difference can add up really quickly, and you might spend those 100 euros that you just saved on buying a 7800 XT on your power bill instead. And even if the power cost doesn't concern you at all, I do think that the 4070 Super is in a really good spot right now. It gets a really nice performance bump over the previous model, while being faster, while being more efficient, and while having a much stronger feature set than the RX 7800 XT. Now, of course, it's not perfect, and I also wish that it was even faster, even cheaper, but at the end of the day, if you're looking at what you can buy at this price point, I do think that the 4070 Super is a great GPU to get. It performs really well on 1080p and 1440p, and even if you want to game on 4K resolution without buying a $1,000 GPU, it holds up reasonably well with upscaling. Now, the 4070 Ti Super is in a bit of a tricky position. Now, the original Ti wasn't really worth the upgrade over the old 4070, and the Ti Super doesn't really change that at all. If anything, it's even in a bit of a worse position, with the 4070 Super getting relatively better and the 4080 Super costing significantly less than its predecessor. And please don't get me wrong, I don't think this is a bad product. It is a bit better than the 4070 Ti, and 16 gigabytes of VRAM is a great upgrade. But I still think that it will only make sense if you really need those dual encoders, or you really need a new NVIDIA card with 16 gigs of VRAM for productivity tasks. But from a pure gaming perspective, the prices need to drop down further, so it's only 15 to 20% more expensive than the Super for the Ti Super to make sense. So yeah, let's see how that will unfold. Now, that's all I had for today, but before I go, let's talk about the sponsor of this video. This video was brought to you by Seasonic and their Vertex power supplies. These fully modular power supplies are extremely efficient and very quiet due to their fan design and their hybrid fan mode that stops the fans completely under 40% load. They come with a variety of connections for any kind of system you have in mind, including the 12-volt high-power cable for the latest NVIDIA graphics cards. And to wrap it all up, they now offer a nice and cozy 12-year-long warranty. Check them out using the links in the description below. Thank you all for watching and sticking to the end of this video. I hope it was useful enough. If you liked it and you want to see more videos like this one, please do consider clicking that subscribe button so you never miss my future uploads. Bye guys, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!